Phone because we're going to film this and put it up on the web, or parts of it on the web. And thank you very much first for coming at fairly short notice to this launch of this report. My name is Bill Etchickson. I'm the director of the European Union of Progressive Judaism office here in Brussels. We just opened in November. The European Union of Progressive Judaism represents liberal progressive Jews around the world. More than 1.5 million. It's the majority practice of Judaism where I come from, the United States, even though I've lived in Europe, where it's more minority. We did feel the need to open up here in Brussels and show and contribute to the work being done by the European Commission, Union in general, on Jewish issues, and to show another face of Judaism, which is with women as rabbis, with full gender equality, with a theology that's adapted to the modern day contemporary Europe. And we felt that we needed to do reports that were, or events and studies that actually contribute to the policy issues facing the European Union, not just the religious issues, but also historical and other types of human rights and rule of law issues. And this is where this project comes in. I had been working with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. We brought an exhibition called State of Deception to the European Parliament. And during these conversations with Katerina at the European Commission, we really learned that the rule of law, or respect of democracy, one of the key ingredients of being a member of the European Union was to respect your own history vis-a-vis the catastrophe of World War II and the Holocaust. And so the idea for this report came out of that realization that an independent report which sort of looked at who was doing well, who was doing badly in binary terms, would be helpful for the Commission to be able to go to these countries and say, look, you should really need to improve, and you have to change, or congratulations. So that was my motivation that got me started doing this report. I looked at it as a sort of, I'd done some work with Freedom House in the United States, and they do these reports on the freedom of democracy, whether it's advancing and decreasing. They're showing decreasing respect for democracy. They do reports on the rule of law and freedom on the internet. And it was in that vein that we thought we would do country profiles and rank them. Now, to do the report, let's see if this, yeah. So to do the, it's a little slow, but anyhow, to do the report, I assembled a group of researchers and Holocaust specialists from 2 American universities, my alma mater, Yale, and Grinnell College, which is a small liberal arts college in the Midwest in America. Both had strong Holocaust study programs, and both sent students who came and spent all last summer traveling throughout Europe, researching this subject. And then what we did was I edited the country chapters, took a lot to make sure they were kind of similar, and we checked them often with European Union Progressive Judaism leaders in various countries. When we didn't have a place to check them, or a person to check them, I often went to a Yale professor, for example, reviewed the world specialist on Croatian history, reviewed the Croatia chapter and made extensive changes and gave extensive insights. A friend also from Yale, who's the American ambassador to Sofia, checked and had that section checked, because we didn't have an office there at the European Union for Progressive Judaism. Hopefully after this report, Sonia, we will have some interest in growing our movement there as well. But for example, it was the European Union for Progressive Judaism who checked the Austria section. So in the end, I mean, Freedom House does a lot of science in their ratings, and I read very technical books about how you do ratings, and from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. We didn't have the resources or the will, and so what I did was something just very simple. Read green or yellow. Yellow is caution, red is you have a problem, and green is you're doing pretty well. And the countries that we found, I mean, the basic premise was that there were countries that were rehabilitating war criminals, rewriting their history to minimize their own guilt. And the 4 countries that stood out in Central Europe were Poland, Hungary, Croatia, and the Baltics. Now, they face different types of challenges, each of them, and they have different histories. So we have to account for that Hungary had its own government. Poland, during the war, Poland did not. Croatia had its own government, a collaborationist government. The Baltics did not. But there was a common theme of trying to minimize their own guilt and really rehabilitate war criminals in at least the Baltics, Croatia, and Hungary. Poland put in last year a very controversial Holocaust law, which we try to explain why it did this and why it changed, but essentially with the same theme that Poles suffered as much, were as much victims, that the communist occupation was as bad as the Nazi occupation in many ways, and that you couldn't really even look at Polish history or talk about Polish responsibility for what happened at all. And we see this in countries, I think it was interesting that you see this in countries that are overall run by populist nationalist governments. So a lot of the other issues, rule of law, the freedom of the press, freedom of the court, these are issues that are in these countries, especially Poland and Hungary. But those were the 4 countries that we really found have a long way to go. I think the 2, Poland and Hungary, have gone bad more recently under the recent regime, whereas in the Baltics there's been a lot of progress, but it's still, they really need to go further, and they were later into the game. Overall, going into the European Union produced progress from 2000 to 2010, 11. We were seeing that to get into the European Union, you really had to re-look at your history and come to terms with it. And there was progress, and it's in these last 5 years that the reports show in most of these countries that there's been a real regression. Okay? I mean, Eastern Europe, I just wanted to emphasize, one of the issues I came across while doing this report was that we were comparing apples and oranges often. I mean, the history in Central Europe, the bloodlands, is different than in Western Europe, where people, the bloodlands were where people were killed. The Western Europe, Belgium, Netherlands, where people were sent away. The numbers were smaller. There's still the same issues of coming to terms with your own responsibility, but it is, you know, in many ways unfair to say Lithuania is red and Denmark is red, because the situation was completely different. So, I mean, there is, in general in Western Europe, less of an issue, I'd say, it's less on the front pages. But what we did find was that, I'll go back to Romania, that there are problems, and I'll get to them. Now, in Central Europe, not everything was bleak, and this is why Soren, who he can tell the story of how we met. He was the ambassador in Washington when Romania did set up, I think, set up the Wiesel Commission. He was very active in setting this commission up. You know, Romania faced, I think, the same tendencies as its neighbors, all during the communist period, to basically not talk about this issue. And then after there was freedom, to revive, please, to revive the sense of that there were war, that actually Antonescu was a hero, and that Romania was innocent of the Holocaust. And I mean, that's overstating it, certainly, Soren, but created this commission with Elie Wiesel, which really came to terms, I think, with the, produced an independent report that changed pretty much everything. And now, I mean, in Romania, you find the general staff is receiving education on responsibility during the war, to disobey illegal orders, to really be careful and understand what happened during World War II. So Romania, I found, as as a big positive exception. And I also found the sort of international commission type of report really useful. And I mean, I know this has been debated in Croatia to create an international commission of historians that would, for example, come to terms with what the fascist government did there and with what happened at Jasenovac, the concentration camp in Croatia, where there's debate over numbers, who was killed, who's responsible, and so forth. So I would think for all these countries, there would be a real need for independent assessment. Bulgaria, too. I mean, Bulgaria often presents itself as the hero saving its Jews that were on its own land, but doesn't acknowledge that Jews, its government, and the king, whose son is trying to whitewash his father's reputation, that the king was responsible for sending the Jews to their death in Thracia, places that they occupied, Macedonia and Thracia. And the Bulgarian government still has not admitted that. So we gave them a sort of a yellow card. We didn't find that it was such a egregious, and there was progress, but they really they could do some additional work, should we say. Now in the West, we did find fewer problems. There were some problems I'm going to talk about in Italy, a little bit in Denmark we're concerned about, but the biggest surprise for me was Austria. When the researcher came back and said, you know, Austria is doing really well, I immediately thought of Waldheim and the idea that Austrians believed they were the first victims of the war rather than the participants and perpetrators. And Kurt Waldheim's election I covered as a journalist in the 1980s, so I couldn't believe he was a former UN Secretary General, but also German general during the war. I couldn't believe that Austria actually was coming to terms with its past, and I was troubled by the fact that, you know, there's a coalition now that is anti-migrant and has a coalition with the far right, which comes out of has its past in the Nazi movement. So I couldn't believe that Austria really in 20 years had made a big difference, changed. And I kept questioning it and questioning the researcher. And I did find, you know, for example, on art restitution, also I'd read the movie, seen the movie about Klimt and how they refused to hand back. The Austrian government was portrayed pretty poorly. But I checked with the world's expert on art restitution, and, you know, they really are they've gone the furthest. It surprised me. The Eisenstadt report, there was a report on looted art that came out in December, also pointed to Austria as a success story. So in many other ways, too, it wasn't just about art. We found Austria was actually making significant movements, perhaps even that having a far-right member of your government was forcing the government to be more proactive on this subject. So Austria was one surprise. And France. This I'd witnessed and lived through, but you know, when I arrived in France in the 1980s, there was a Vichy president, François Mitterrand, and there was no talk of French responsibility. Today, if you look, ever since Jacques Chirac, the first post-war president, they've really accepted that there are French responsibility for sending their Jews to their death. That it was the French police, not just German soldiers, that rounded up the Jews. And I'm always moved when I go to Paris now and see on every school, we were talking about schools where every school there's a plaque saying on this day in 1942, French police, not German police, French police came and took away these children. And you'll find that everywhere in France, and all schools that have pre-war histories. Now, there's still problems, and we did look also in the report at the government attitudes, but also the opposition parties, civil society, and obviously Jean-Marie Le Pen and his daughter have issues still coming to terms with Vichy, and the new, in the West, that's a picture of Dieudonné, a comedian who's been convicted of anti-Semitic hate speech and so forth. And in the West, the challenge, I think, from the newly arrived Arab immigrants is, or even second generation, of coming to terms with the Holocaust and accepting it is very tenuous at best. There are movements in France, I think, to deal with that. The government has been incredibly proactive with a top-down, very French top-down educational movement. And I know some second-generation Arab North African teachers who try to emphasize the commonality of the Jewish and Arab experience, both in Morocco, for example, but also in being a minority in a predominantly non-Muslim, non-Jewish country. So France, I was really surprised by. Here too, I mean, Denmark is famous for saving all its Jews. The story is actually a little more complicated than that, and Denmark has moved to be very anti-migrant and restrict. There's been debates about circumcision and kashrut, so it seems like the issue needs to be revisited there, at least a little bit, even though its story is still, most of its Jews survived. But it wasn't necessarily because all Danes were so courageous. In Italy, the arrival of there's been long-term problems with art restitution and an acceptance of this idea that Mussolini wasn't really so bad after all, and I think the new government still has to come to terms with that. And Katerina will talk about this, I won't go on that much longer, but what really inspired me to do this, inspired us to open the office, was the sense that the European Union thinks these issues are important, believes this European Commission really has made a series of moves, and I'll let Katerina describe them, but that this report could help reinforce those political actions that it's taking. But it's really thanks to Katerina and to her higher-ups that we really feel that we need to invest in Brussels and work more here. Israel. We didn't study Israel that much, but I did note, and we do note, and I've talked to some Israelis, and that, you know, all too often they're out of realism, out of the idea that Brussels is sort of anti-Israeli. There is these alliances with the people, the leaders who are the most rewriting history. And here's the Prime Minister Netanyahu with Viktor Orban, you know, both are nationalists, I guess. There's some affinity, but Viktor Orban, the nationalist leaders who are most problematic in this study, often are supporting Israeli policy more than in Brussels and so forth. Or at least that's the Israeli perception. I don't want to, it's not a huge part of this study, but it was something that I just wanted to end on. And what we're going to do now is, first of all, if anyone has any questions, I'll take them now or later or afterwards. No? Katerina was going to speak next, and then Soren about Romania, and Sonia maybe can conclude. Thanks. It's you, yeah, you have to put it on, I think. Even if we're few, just for that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes, thank you very much, Bill. I would really like to congratulate you, the European Union of Progressive Judaism, as well as Yale University and Grinnell College for having put this report together. I think it is good to have, you know, this kind of independent reports. Maybe for the press who's here, I have to put in a disclaimer. It's not a commission report. It doesn't reflect the commission's opinion. It's something that we take in also into our analysis. I think it is indeed very important to look into the way we are dealing as a European collective, let's say, with our history. Some of you may have seen President Juncker's statement yesterday at the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day for this year, where he said that he didn't think that in his lifetime he was going to see again that Jews would be afraid to show their identity. And it's in this context that we look at this. We know from different studies, including the FRA study also that came out in December, that for the Jewish community, remembering the Holocaust is the #1 identifying factor. So when there is revisionism, when there is Holocaust denial or trivialization, it goes straight to the identity of the Jewish community. And that's why it's, I think, so important, and also our responsibility to ensure that the way the Holocaust and the Shoah is seen and taught and remembered remains with us, remains in the core of the European Union. And it's been said in different forms and versions, including by First Vice President Timmermans, that the European Union was built on the ashes of the Shoah. And I think we always have to remember that in order to know how to also build our future. We have seen also from the FRA report that whenever there is a doubt about the way the Holocaust is being seen, that in fact it is seen as the #1 anti-Semitic statement. So when someone says the Holocaust was a myth, or Jews talk too much about the Holocaust, they exploit the Holocaust for their own interests, all of this is perceived as the most anti-Semitic remark. And again, it's a question also of knowledge. And we have also always argued that you should not look only, especially in schools, at the Holocaust, but you can only understand the abyss of the Shoah when you look at Jewish life in Europe beforehand, and look at what the Jewish community has contributed in order to understand how it was interrupted and erased by the Nazis and by all those who collaborated, and what it means to have Jewish life in Europe today, and therefore also what it means to have anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism rising again today in Europe. So we need to have all of this as part of the curricula in schools to ensure that people understand this. And it doesn't just concern those countries where the Shoah physically took place. I think it's important to understand for every member of the European Union how important this aspect was of European history in order to create the union that we have today, built on freedom, built on democratic values, built on the rule of law, and also what it means in terms of of the values that we need to defend. Some of you may know that we brought out a Eurobarometer last week, this week actually, 22nd, where it is said, where it becomes clear that Holocaust is seen only, let's say, by about half of the European citizens. Holocaust denial, seen only by half of the people as a problem in their country. So there is not that much of a perception that it actually still exists. The Eurobarometer measures the perception among all European countries, and we see that there are big differences between the countries. So in some countries like Sweden, France, also Germany, there is a very high awareness of this still being an issue today. And then you have other countries where it's much less of an interest, a perception rather. At the same time, we see that 13 member states are the majority is of the opinion that actually the Holocaust is sufficiently taught. So we have a discrepancy between, on the one side, seeing that Holocaust denial is not that much of an issue, and then on the other side seeing that it is sufficiently taught, and actually interesting. I found that interesting. The shorter the education, the more people feel that they're actually not informed about the Holocaust, so that they don't get any information about European history in this particular area in their school education. And I think this is something that we should take serious, because well, there are different arguments for this, but I think that especially students that then go into more practical jobs, which means they have a shorter education usually beforehand, don't have the chance to continue this kind of education at universities. So they need to be able to get that kind of education already in their basic education. Holocaust denial and trivialization, as you know, is banned across the European Union by the Framework Decision on Racism and Xenophobia. This legislation needs to be transposed by the member states. It was passed in 2008, and still there are a few countries who have not properly transposed it. So in most countries there is something, but it's one question is the transposition, and the other question is, of course, the implementation. So to ensure, for example, with regards to Holocaust denial, that Holocaust deniers are being put to trial, and that is again true online and offline. We've said it many times that there are no two different realities. And the virtual reality also needs to be taken into account when it comes to perpetrators. And I think more generally, the issue of Holocaust denial being maybe more of an issue more recently in the public debate. Probably it has to do with social media on the one side, but it also has to do with the rise of populism and the idea that personal truth can become a universal truth, and then universal truths are also put into question, because you can put anything into question. And Deborah Lipstadt, she says at that point, the Earth is not flat. So usually you have facts that are not to be put into question. And I think it's a very difficult debate that we need to have in order to ensure that there is knowledge about the Shoah on the one side, and then I would say also an empathy with the victims and those descendants of the victims, in order to ensure that we do not lose this understanding. And that brings me to my last point: the way how we actually transmit this knowledge and also empathy. I think it's really challenging, and there are people much more apt in the room who actually know how to do this in a professional way. From what I can see, young people, they do have empathy with victims, and it's a question how you actually raise this. Very often, we see a finger pointing again with regards to populism only to anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial coming from within the Muslim community. But we know that that by acknowledging the discriminations they may face in everyday life, they also see and feel this empathy, and where it can lead to if the rule of law is against you, which is not the case in Europe today, and what it therefore means also to have this rule of law. Last year we screened a film, 2017, at the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm sorry, I think it was 2018 actually, which is called Nana, and it's done by a young 25-year-old director who is a grandchild of an Auschwitz survivor, and she accompanied her mother and to different stations in the life of the grandmother. And the grandmother became very active in going to schools then in the 60s and 70s, also here in Belgium, by the way. And I thought this was a very good way, a new way also, in relating this difficult topic to young people. It was done by somebody, it was done through the eyes of a young person. And she said that whenever she went to schools, actually, it was very often Muslim students that responded very positively to her film, while she had gone in there thinking, this will be very difficult. So I think the question of how we do this will be the question of the next years. We know that less and less of the survivors are there to tell their testimonies. So it will be upon us to ensure that we will relate the memory to the next generation. And for that reason, following the Declaration on Anti-Semitism by the Council in December, Commissioner Jourova has announced to create a working group with the member states that will bring the member states together in the context of the high-level group on racism and xenophobia, where we'll discuss these different topics, because essentially they are member states' responsibilities. Every member state, they do their own curricula, they have their own views, they have their own historical background, but we will try to see with them how far we can go and see how far we can implement this declaration so it doesn't remain an empty shell, because what we need really is change on the ground with regards to the perception among the Jewish community and anti-Semitism, so that when, in 5-6 years down the road, there will be a new survey by the Fundamental Rights Agency on anti-Semitism among European Jews, that we really see that there is a change and an improvement of the way they perceive anti-Semitism in their environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina. And I do want to emphasize that the report was done to help you, but with no commission money, no commission guidance. It was really independent, totally independent. Now, I wanted to introduce Sorin Ducaru, who is was the Romanian ambassador to Washington, and I then here in NATO with the Assistant Secretary General, and did much to really start the turnaround process in Romania, and to hear your thoughts and your reactions.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for including me. What I will do, I will tell you a bit of my story and how through it the transformation process in Romania and with regard to the Holocaust issue really unfolded. I became Romania's ambassador to Washington at a very young age. I was 36, and I happened to be the youngest in the diplomatic corps. And it was not by chance. One of the objectives of choosing a generation, and I was the oldest of a team of 37 or 40 at that time, was of course linked to Romania's aspirations to be integrated in the Euro-Atlantic community, to launch some important economic ties, but it was also linked to coming to terms with the past, but interestingly, mainly with its communist past and what happened during the communist period in relationship and the influence of the Securitate during that time. And very honestly, the Americans were happy to have an embassy team of very young people that biologically could not have been linked with the former regime and so on. So that was an important issue. The Holocaust issue came very close to my attention because it was important for some of the Jewish friends, but it made a very strong impression upon me visiting the Holocaust Museum as a young ambassador, and then I made sure that it was part of the program of high officials and so on, because I had the I consider myself quite good in history. My mother is a historian, it's true. She's specialized in antique and medieval history, but I realized that if somebody like me, who at least had in-house the whole library and we were part of the dialogue, had no clue whatsoever about what happened in Romania, because there was no teaching in schools about this and so on. That's really an important issue, an important gap. Then the fact that I discovered a very important, I would say, Romanian Jewish heritage in the United States, much more than I would have ever thought. People, some with important positions like Richard Shifter at the White House at that time, or people from the cultural world. I remember some of our honorary consuls that we had the chance to appoint had this important and interesting heritage, and they felt very deeply and positively about their roots and origins. Sensitized me about this. I understood how important it was to dig a bit deeper into what happened, and come to terms with the past also on this dimension. At the Holocaust Museum, I had the chance to get acquainted with two persons that have remained my friends, Paul Shapiro and Radu Ioanid. Radu's actually emigrated from Romania during the communist period, and I think it was realized that it is important to address this issue top down, especially since in the early and mid 90s. So I became ambassador in 2001, but early and mid 90s, there was a sense in Romania of rehabilitation of, for example, Marshal Antonescu, who was the leader during the Second World War. There were some historic reasons, because Romania was a victim of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which has impacted the Baltic countries. Of course, Poland, that was partitioned after that pact of 23rd of August 1939, but then the eastern part of Romania, so-called Bessarabia, was also through this pact annexed by the Soviet Union, and Antonescu was the one who joined Nazi Germans in 41 to recover the territory. But no one was really bringing the atrocities that happened, especially with the Jewish population, the Gypsy, the Roma population in that part of the world, so interestingly enough, the fact that this tendency of rehabilitation was becoming visible in the mid-90s, that also brought the first elements of Antonescu's responsibility in the Holocaust. There was another complication, the fact that another component of Holocaust of Jewish families sent to death camps from Romanian territory was at least for a number of years during the Second World War not pursued by the Antonescu regime, who actually sent 300,000 or plus from the, let's say, the Bessarabian part, the northeastern part of Romania, but from another part, from the northwestern part, that was at that time under the Horthy regime, that was complicating the issue as well, and some consider that, well, now it's too much responsibility put on the burdens of country and the regime. So in that context, I was really lucky to have the chance to meet Professor Elie Wiesel in his small library apartment in New York. And like for everyone, it made a profound impression. And also we discussed about his own roots in the northern town of Romania, of Sighet. I happened to be born, have been born in the neighborhood in that part, in a town who is close. I didn't grow up there, but I visited a number of times. And the idea of having an independent commission headed by somebody who has this huge moral and intellectual profile that happens to have some roots, roots in Romania, and with of course, with the support of the Holocaust Museum. And the work of the Wiesel Commission was extremely important. It not just clarified historic facts, but then it came with some ideas and proposals, and they were met thankfully and positively back home. Also because there was I think a sense of change and openness towards having this recognition, but also doing something so that the young generation also learn about it. So some of the conclusions was that this has to be included in the curricula of elementary schools and high schools, which is now the case. There's one important aspect which I remember when meeting at NATO with you and Paul Shapiro, we thought could be emulated in other places. There's an important curriculum on that in the Romanian National Defense College, where officers are trained, including for missions abroad, that yes, this is what you can do legally, you cannot do. And by the way, look at this part of history, where officers that wore the uniform that you're so proud of course, in different time, and they really obeyed, they gave or obeyed illegal or wrong morally orders. So that's important. Other aspects that are important, of course, establishing a Holocaust Memorial Day museum. I think there is a square in Romania. There's also a separate Elie Wiesel memorial in Bucharest, and the house of the Elie Wiesel family that was confiscated by the communist regime was given back to the Wiesel family, and now is a museum. There were other aspects that had to do with the Jewish heritage in general, so mapping of cemeteries. I remember I had in my embassy team 2 colleagues that were coming from the Jewish community, and one of them came with the idea to have a virtual online map of cemeteries and genealogy and so on. Also a discovery of a mass grave that was linked to the Holocaust, and then documented and what it meant. Link, of course, with not just with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, but also with Yad Vashem and that community. And I would There is an institute in Bucharest on small institute on Holocaust and its manifestation and Romanian territory. I want to end also on one note that I think has to do with the way the mind has has changed, and or the mindset is consolidated, especially at the young generation. I should mention that somebody who used to be a very close and dear friend, and I say used to be is because he passed away very young, a couple of months ago, Ambassador Mihnea Constantinescu. He has led the work under the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on the working definition of anti-Semitism. I'm just having on his website the message that has been sent by the IHRA with condolences. Again, somebody who did not come from the Jewish community, and a diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who did multilateral affairs, who happened to working close both on the U.S. side with the Holocaust Museum, but also with Israel and Yad Vashem, and who happened that at that certain moment in his career, he led the work and negotiation during the 2016 Romanian chairmanship of this work. And I should say that every now and then you'll find the kind of pushbacks and this issues of switching a bit, turning around the historic facts. I don't see a pushback, a phenomenon right now, although there may be one or two articles, or you see some sites or some Facebook accounts. It's definitely not the kind of strange current that I think was defining a bit the situation in 1993, 94 until 1995. But I think we should remain vigilant about this, and we should continue to really be able to teach these facts, because if we really don't internalize the history, we risk that in some forms it might come back. So that's the story.
No, thank you, Soren. I mean, it is your story. When you first told it to me, was one of the inspirations for doing this report. I think Romania has a lot to teach its neighbors on this, while remaining modest. But the International Commission and that experience is really two big takeaways that I came from this year of research. So thanks for coming at the very beginning and the very end of the report. Next is just a couple minutes, and we will have time for questions, and I hope there will be some. Sonia Gutner of the EUPJ, the first woman chairman, female chairwoman of this organization, first non-Brit, and the woman who took on Angela Merkel, but that's a long story, or forced Angela Merkel to get equality for all types of Jews in Germany.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming. It's a real privilege for me to be here this morning. We are very, very grateful for this report for the most obvious reasons, that it describes the reality of most of our communities in most of the European countries that we live in. Perhaps a little bit of history of the EUPJ, because that really explains where we're coming from and why we are here in Brussels nowadays. The European Union for Progressive Judaism is the European part, obviously, of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which represents just under 2 million Jews worldwide. And the European region has always played a significant role
for the very simple reason that progressive Judaism is a product of Europe and most specifically of Germany. It originated there in the 18th, 19th century. It's about 200 years old, and in many ways the genuine, authentic European contribution to Judaism. And since we believe in a pluralistic version of Judaism, and since we believe that possibly one of the reasons why Judaism is still alive today is the dialogue of many voices within one religion, we feel that it is very important nowadays to make sure that a liberal, pluralistic voice is heard in the very, very complex political contexts which we are all facing in our various countries and across Europe. We are very privileged to have Bill as our director in the Brussels office. It was a long time in the making to open this office. We're based in London, have been based traditionally in London for the past 90 years. And for the first time now, we are trying to be more active on the continent for a number of reasons. Even though we do have a clear separation of church and state in most European countries, in all European countries, we have become very aware, and the reference to Germany would be one, that of course legislation and the setup of the relationship with religions in each country have a huge impact on the Jewish community, on the wider Jewish community, not just the progressive Jews. And we do feel that in a time where fundamentalist tendencies are obvious almost everywhere, it is important to include religious voices into the wider public discourse and to make it absolutely clear that you can be a person who derives their moral compass from religion, from faith, and yet openly support and hopefully contribute to pluralistic societies. I think that is an important point. And we have been very impressed with the work of the European Commission in recent years. And so it felt just right to come to Brussels now. And we opened our office on the second weekend, I think in November, the weekend which again was deeply steeped in history, with of course 9th of November and as well the 100 years since the end of the First World War. So this is sort of an ongoing topic for our work here, and I think it is extremely relevant, as we've also heard from Katerina and Sorin, to make sure that the work we do here relates to history and that we learn from history. Holocaust remembrance, and that's why this report is so relevant for the 27th of January, is in itself changing. We have heard that the eyewitnesses, the survivors of the Shoah, are almost no longer with us. We need to find different ways to communicate. We need to find different ways to teach our young people what the lessons of history have to be, and we need to make it relevant for them. We need to, as we all know, young people will listen and will be open-minded if they understand why what you're telling them and how what you're telling them relates to their everyday reality. And I want to be very clear. The Holocaust affected Jews more than any other minority, but it affected other minorities in Europe as well. So when we're talking about lessons to be learned from history, we're not exclusively focusing on Jewish history and on Jewish matters, but we are focusing on the very basis of what is required in a society that is pluralistic, that has various voices, that inevitably has conflicting voices, but needs to find a common denominator that allows everyone the freedom that we all want to enjoy and all want to live in. I think that is a very, very relevant point, and I think that, and I hope that this is going to be one of the aspects of our work here. I live in Germany, currently in Cologne. We've heard it is a country which is hugely challenged by the huge immigration. And we usually talk about the challenges more than about the opportunities. And I would think the Jewish community in Germany has been very actively involved in making sure and reaching out to migrants. And I would hope that we can model best practices across Europe and can all learn from each other. We have heard, and I don't think you can in any way overemphasize the importance of recent anti-Semitic studies. The shock goes through all our communities. The massive security issues we have, which are drastically increasing. The fact that large numbers of Jews in Europe actually think about leaving Europe. Is it responsible to raise children here? If you raise your children here, how Jewish can you be to the outside? These are questions which I agree we 10 years ago did not think we would need to discuss, and we obviously do. So this is a massive challenge. The Jewish community overall is challenged by a number of factors, not just anti-Semitism and not just outside factors, but even inside. The demographics in many countries are extremely fragile. We are going to see huge changes in the setup and the structure of our communities. I think it is fairly safe to predict that progressive Judaism in particular is going to become a very urban phenomenon. It is going to be focused on the large cities and the larger areas, conglomerates. And we need to be prepared for that. And we need to be able to do this in a context which is open, not just to Jews, but to other religions as well, to other minorities, which has a very common understanding that the terrible history of the 20th century has given us the basis to learn from and to have it as a common frame of reference and develop our future from there. So I think this is one of the hugely important factors and aspects of this report, and we've already heard, and fake news and alternative facts and all of that. I mean, you know, I always, my quote is always, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. And we need to be able to really discuss facts and be clear how relevant they are and how consequential they are and how much we need to take our governments to task to make sure that we can really contribute to open and pluralistic societies.
Thank you. Well, we do have some time, some questions. Well, there's at least one hand. Yeah, please. Here, I can be the man going around. Yeah.
My voice is strong enough.
Okay. For the video, though, you do need to speak.
I need to speak in for the
Yes.
video. Okay. Just to introduce.
Yeah, I think.
What?
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm Charlotte Gutmann, and to summarize who I am, I'm just going to tell you that I wrote a piece on propaganda versus ethics in public relations, which has been my profession since I work. And it was written during my year with the International European Relations Institute, just to put it clear. I am a second generation syndrome. I am the elderly daughter of parents. On one side, my mother was born in Kiev, and on the other side, my father was born in Berlin. Both are survivors. Both have suffered from starvation and fear. What I want to tell is that I don't have children. And I'm not the only Jewish woman who doesn't have children. Here in Europe and in Israel, I have a lot of connections, women who didn't want to have children. When people ask me, I'm going to give a very private reason, but when people ask me why you don't have children, nobody will take them away from me. I'm married. I have nephews and nieces and godchildren. So I'm surrounded by the young generation. What I would like to answer to Katarina is that maybe you mentioned that the survivors are not any longer with us, and my parents passed away. But children of those survivors have a lot to tell. Because I lived with my parents 23 years. I also suffered. I've gone through 30 years of therapy, and I think I could contribute to witness what this generation, my generation, can tell about the past generation is not any longer. So, considering your program and your strategy for the future to transmit this period and the Shoah to the coming generations and to long.
No, you're well a little bit, but that's not. No, it's not working. That's all. Does this work? Yeah. Yeah. It was for the.
Yeah, but I'm not on the video.
Okay. Yes, and she wanted to tell her story to the video. So.
This is my story, you know.
Yeah.
I always
Okay.
miss opportunities.
But if I could just make one comment to it, which is, I could make one comment, which is, we did, one of the things that was really moving for me was to get young people who did the research, students, to learn about this, and my own children to learn. And I hope, you know, the experience of involving students and will help them realize how important the subject is. So,
Thank you. Hello?
but
Yes, I thought it was not working.
did you have a question that you wanted to ask us, or just?
No, I wanted to submit this
testimony.
solution, to put it into your strategy for the future. I'll be happy to contribute.
I see.
And also, I would like to say that there are a lot of books that are witnessing this period. And maybe you can organize from the EU that books like, for instance, I just finished a book by Robert Badinter, who used to be a Ministry of Justice in France. He's 90 years old, and he didn't expect his book to have so much success. He wrote about the life of his grandmother, who came from Bessarabia. So I advise the people to read this book because it's a very nice reading. And I think maybe the EU can organize that in the schools in Europe, there would be obligatory books that should be read by the students so that they won't say in the next study that Holocaust didn't exist or they don't know about it, etc. So to improve the knowledge about it, the awareness of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And one of the things we did study in the report was education.
Yes.
And one of the danger signs that we saw in places like Hungary was the rehabilitation of anti-Semitic interwar writers who were being put intentionally back on the curriculum. So we do go through that and study each country and say what is being taught and what is not being taught, and good and bad. So thank you for coming, and thank you for the contribution. Any other questions? Yes. Here. Now I need your number. Sure.
My name is Laura Perez, and I'm a journalist for the Spanish news agency EFE. And during your interventions and also on the report, you mentioned the need for actually every European Union country to remember and to talk about the Holocaust. Spain, as Portugal or others, were neutral during the conflict. And my question is, from the Commission side and from your side, how do you find the situation? Do you think the Holocaust is sufficiently remembered, taught, or explained, or are we lacking just because we were in a direct part of the conflict, some kind of knowledge, necessary knowledge for the future about it?
Well, it's a great question. One of my regrets with the report is that we didn't include Spain. We tried. The researcher couldn't find much. It was midsummer. Everyone was on vacation. It was out of a lack of resources. And I do think there's a lot to be done in Spain In the past, I know there's been issues and remain issues about the archives, the interwar archives. And I know in a previous job that I tried to do something on the Civil War and was told by the previous government that that was not a good idea to try to digitize the war dead from the Civil War. I'm very curious to find out more what is going on in Spain. At one hand, I know there's a big movement to recognize the Jewish heritage in Spain, and you go to any Spanish city and now you see the Jewish streets and so forth. But I think if I had a new project to do, I'd like to do a project about Franco and the war. I think there needs to be a lot more research done. Sorry we couldn't do it in this one, maybe a next one.
Maybe to add from the Eurobarometer, I just checked it now, 60% of respondents in Spain say that they feel that the Holocaust not sufficiently taught in the schools. And if we look on the positive side, only 5% say, yes, it's definitely sufficiently taught, and 20% say it's to some extent taught. So I think, I think actually that the general population perceives this enormous tragedy in some way, and that actually people are interested in being informed. But of course, I mean, every country has their own history and their own parts of history to come to terms with. Yeah? Yet I think that the Holocaust in all its dimensions, and we, for example, we will have on Monday at the European Commission a training on the role of civil servants in bringing about the Holocaust, because there were people sitting on their desks just signing off decrees, and then thousands of people were being killed somewhere else in Europe. So I think there is a universal message to be had and learned from the Shoah, and also how it, one aspect that intrigues me more and more is how we got to that stage. So it starts with hate speech. If Hitler had announced at the beginning of his term that he was going to kill 6 million Jews, everyone would have said, it's not going to happen. We are all against it. It's not going to happen. But how actually step by step this was achieved, and then in 1942 with the Wannsee Conference, the decision on the final solution of the Jews, I think this is something that we need to be aware of even today. What does hate speech do? And we see it with the internet, it's becoming ever more difficult. But I think what Elie Wiesel also said, what hurt the victim most was not this, I don't know what he exactly said, screaming of the oppressors, or the acting of the oppressors, but the silence of the bystanders. And I think that's a lesson that we can universally also learn from the Holocaust, to speak up against injustice, even in your own environment where it's most difficult. In your sports club, in your parents' association, in your school, where it's the most difficult when you're surrounded by people that you know. And so all these messages, I think learning about how the Holocaust could come about is just a starting point for messages that we need today.
Yeah. Steve, I'll give you the...
Does it work? Okay. I'm Steve Bremmel. My night job is president of the Liberal Synagogue of Brussels, IJC. And we're talking about Holocaust denial. My question, well, first I'll make a point, what I believe. A lot of people who deny the Holocaust, it's not that they don't know it happens. They're using it as a tactic. And because in the same breath, when they deny the Holocaust, they say, but if you continue doing X, Y, Z, you're going to go back to the ovens. And this is manifested in people who deny the Holocaust in football matches, who then do slogans which talk about gas, gas, gas. It's very cynical. So in a strange way, it's not an education program, but how can you deal, anybody who denies the Holocaust actually knows about it. There are vast areas, groups of people who don't know anything, but they don't know history, period. So it's a very, it's very cynical. So how do you deal with, so they're just using it as a lever.
This is an argument that is often made, saying if you criminalize Holocaust denial, you actually create deliberate opposition, especially by, let's say, young people who want to be against our society. I still think it is right that Holocaust denial is criminalized. However, this part that you speak about, I think, is a small group. The larger group are people who relativize the Holocaust or who trivialize it, who make comparisons with today and thereby trivialize it. So, and there, education can do a lot. So I agree with you that it's, people do use this knowledge deliberately, and I mean, we had there is this famous trial with Deborah Lipstadt in Irving. Yeah? So, I mean, of course, but the vast majority of people, I think, just simply does not know enough. When certain jokes are being made or comparisons are being made, they don't know what they're really talking about. So their education can help a lot. For the European Commission, we have very clearly said also that this needs to remain a part, also the educational part. So we are now financing the largest humanities part of the Horizon 2020, goes into a platform that helps research on the Holocaust across Europe with important other institutions like Yad Vashem and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum to ensure also the digitalization of archives. So, we think it's really important to keep this alive and to make the testimonies available to a larger group of people. And we have also joined as EU on the 29th of November the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as permanent international partners to ensure that this, that we can enrich each other and that we can also draw on the experience of that organization. And Commissioner Jourova, on the same day that she presented the Eurobarometer, explicitly tasked us to ensure that within the Commission we'll have a network that can be in touch with IRA on the different areas. So on the Roma genocide, for example, as well, where we have a unit that deals with Roma discrimination, on different aspects of education, on reaching out through integration measures also to newcomers to the society. All these areas, I think, we need to create a network also within the EU and in the Commission. And that is a concrete outcome also of us having acquired the status.
And I would just add that, and I'll go back to you, I would just add that what we were seeing is, it's very hard for, everyone wants to say it's just the Germans who did it, and it's very hard for others to accept their own responsibility because it means accepting that something often terrible happened and that your ancestors did these terrible things or faced choices like in the Baltics. They can be Lithuanian heroes and murderers. And that's very hard to accept. I think there was something to add to you from Spain about liberal Judaism in Spain, and Sonia wanted to add, because we've seen actually a remarkable renaissance. I think we have 3 communities in a country that kicked out all its Jews in 1492. There's really been a change in that.
Since you asked about Spain and Portugal specifically, the history there is particularly relevant because Jewish existence has had this huge gap of almost, of more than actually 500 years. And our communities, all our communities, I mean, the Spanish communities are mostly either implants, mostly from South American communities, Argentina and Brazil mostly, and now more recently the progressive communities are made up of people who rediscover their Jewish heritage in a very, very interesting way. And it was an interesting observation that there's a lot of general interest from the general public into what these communities are doing and into that psychological process. And very interestingly, events these communities do for Holocaust Remembrance Day or for 9th of November are usually communal events which are attended by a broad public audience. Usually there is a lot of support from the municipality and from other organizations. Very often they turn into interfaith events. That's a very, very interesting observation. Because it is actually, as we've said at the beginning of this event, it is a key factor of identification, but not just for the Jewish community in Spain, but also for the wider audience. That's very, very interesting. And if I may say, and to answer your point, Steve, I think we all are aware that we will always have to live with people who deny the Holocaust and who will say whatever attracts attention. And if you say something anti-Semitic, every student knows that in their schools, this will attract attention and you will be sort of the focus of attention. I think we will have to live with that. The question is when it happens, what happens next? When we had those explosions of anti-Semitic rage in the football stadium, what happened? What did the football clubs do? Were they held responsible? What are the consequences? There needs to be an understanding that there is a broad consensus in our society that these things are not acceptable. And we need to make sure that we maintain and develop this consensus. I had an interesting conversation with teachers the other day because many far-right organizations, they target students. They will come to the schoolyards and they will try and advertise and be cool and attract young people. Our teachers very often do not recognize the emblems of these organizations. They do not understand the coded language they use. The young people do, the teachers don't. And it is vitally important that we keep track of these things, that we do have education programs, and they are Europe-wide. I mean, this is not specific to any country. Some organizations are, but most anti-Semitic organizations, they are large organizations, and we need to be clear about recognizing them and then calling them out again. We had a demonstration in Germany not long ago where Combat 18, an illegal extreme right organization, was out on the streets. They're illegal in Germany. They should have never been able to demonstrate. But the police people who were in charge of making sure that the security is maintained, they did not recognize them. They did not recognize the emblems. And these are important factors.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, because it's the perfect example of the IRA definition and how it can be used. Basically, in training, because it's a non-legally binding definition, but in training of educators, of teachers, of law enforcement agencies, the police, the judges, it will help to understand what anti-Semitism is today. And then, of course, you need the additional knowledge of the emblems and really the nitty-gritty. But I think this is why the IRA definition and the adoption of the IRA definition and use of it is so important, because it really helps, I think, to render this home. I also would like to second the issue of the reaction of the authorities. How do they react when, the directors of the schools, the police, when you go there, how do they react when someone comes and says, I've had an anti-Semitic incident? And very often we still see, I don't know, in the schools that the director says, well, there's a Middle East conflict, no wonder this plays out here. These kind of excuses, while there is no excuse for violence in Europe because there's a conflict somewhere else. If we allowed this for all other countries, we would have a difficult situation here. And I think that is why to also add to the Spanish issue, it was so important for Spain and the Spanish government to support the declaration on anti-Semitism that was passed in December, you know, as an expression towards also the Jewish community. We are on your side and we will stand up against any form of anti-Semitism in our country. And finally, maybe to say that I find that accepting Jewish life in a society and is a expression, is a benchmark for a healthy society. And it's also a benchmark for successful integration. And then that opens up very often to accepting all other forms of the other. You know, it shows that diversity is embraced by a society and by individuals in that society. And so also in that larger context, I think it is important to teach more also about Jewish culture and Jewish history.
Yeah. And I would add, any last questions? Thank you, Katrina. Yes, and then. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question for Sorin about the Independent Commission in Romania. I should introduce myself, sorry. I'm Jonathan Lee. I'm Romani from Wales. I work for the European Roma Rights Centre. You might be aware that at the moment there's kind of a movement discussing the possibility of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Roma on anti-Gypsyism throughout Europe. And there's discussions on whether it's at the EU level, if it's taken in member states, and how that would work. So we're very conscious of the idea that this report's brought up in how would you enforce some sort of reconciliation commission on anti-Gypsyism in somewhere like Hungary, for instance, where currently the Minister Balog is saying that Gypsies were never deported from Hungary. So we're looking at particular examples of commissions that have operated in similar ways around the world. So specifically they looked at South Africa post-apartheid. So with this independent commission, to what extent does it cover the persecution of Roma and Romanian territories, including the deportation to Transnistrian camps? And on a side note, I'm not sure, but does Romania recognize explicitly the Roma genocide on the 2nd of August? Thanks.
I can refer to the conclusions of the Wiesel Commission, who include also the responsibility of the World War II Antonescu government in deportation, actually also killing of, I think, if I remember well, the number was 11,000 Gypsy Roma. So although it was about Holocaust and it, focus was the Jewish community while going through the archive and putting the report forward, this has been also covered in that report, and it's part of, again, curricula in schools and training at a National Defense College and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I can add that I think the idea that I was promoting in the report of an independent commission would include what happened to the Roma. I mean, because that is part of the overall story and important part. And so I would hope in the countries that have the challenges, we would work together to get these independent commissions up off the ground to produce these reports. We'd be glad to, I think the UPJ would be very glad to do that. And to add to what you were saying about how we treat our minorities as a definition of ourselves, and if Jews can't live, which is in Europe, then it's a failure. I think the same thing, if we can't remember the same purpose, is if we forget what happened, then we won't be able to move past it in the same way. So for me, that was the essential motivation to make sure that we don't forget. Any last questions? I think we've gone for an hour and a half. It's been pretty good. Yes, in the back. If you could just hand the microphone, you can identify yourself.
Thank you very much, first of all, for a very moving presentation. I'm from London originally, and I was very fortunate to have benefited from some of the best education that Britain has to offer. But we never touched the Holocaust in school whatsoever. I didn't benefit from that in my history lessons at all. And as a Jew, when I was growing up, the Holocaust was very much a part of the dialogue in my family, and so I knew about it from a very young age. But it was only when I got to sort of later in my secondary education that I realized that there was a gap in the education that we were receiving in school. And it was only when I got to university that I met people from all other, educational backgrounds, that I realized that actually no one in my social networks had received any education about World War II and the Holocaust generally. And I don't know if that's an experience that anyone else shares, but I'm very nervous and very anxious about the lack of education on this subject in the UK. And we've talked about education. I completely agree with its importance. But I'm struggling to understand what we can actually do to make sure that it gets on the school curriculums, and what conversations we can be having with headmistresses, headmasters of schools, the relevant people in government, to actually get it on the curriculum. And also I'm curious to know what age you will think is the appropriate age to start teaching students about the Holocaust in schools.
Leaving Britain out of the report was another regret. Brexit, fundamentally different history were the reasons, lack of resources. But there is, like it, to study America, there is a reason to study the British response to the Holocaust, including today. In most of the countries we studied, Holocaust education in the countries that were really grappling with this starts very young. It changes over the time into more sophisticated historical studies, but it does start with general moral lessons where the Holocaust is referred to in a lot of the countries we studied. So you can really start much younger, I think, than you might even pre-teens. It was part of the elementary school curriculum in some countries. Katerina, you were no.
Well, it is very much, and this question is especially a member states issue, and every member state handles it differently. And I think it would be the Commission would be ill-placed to give any kind of direction. What we will provide also in that working group is a possibility for exchange of practices and best practices, and how it actually happens in some member states and maybe not in others. I heard in a discussion with representatives of Yad Vashem, for example, they say not earlier than 10 should one start with that, and that's actually when they start having groups in their memorial. So that is not, it's not my own wisdom, and certainly not the Commission's opinion, but that was an expert expression, let's say. Yeah.
I would just like to add one aspect to the question of education. What I think we can do Europe-wide is support all initiatives for diversity in our schools, and very often, again, it comes down to the nitty-gritty things. For example, in many of our communities are struggling in their various countries to have high Jewish holidays kept free from exams. So students in most European countries are expected to write exams on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, because those dates will not be kept free in official holiday calendars. Things like that help enormously. If you celebrate Rosh Hashanah in a school, just as you would Christmas or as you would other festivals, that helps enormously. And I think this is something which we can support, regardless of what the academic curriculum of each member state needs to be and should be.
What about availability
Right, so I'll end on that. The report is online at www, let's see, I think it was here at the end. No? Well, it's, so you, I think on the press, I know on the press release that you have the, there it is. There it is. So the report is online, it's country by country. You can select each report. The whole report can be downloaded. This afternoon, we're going to finish creating a Kindle ebook, and it will be available. If you see errors or things that you want to contact us about, we'll try to update it and make sure and go back to the researcher involved. And you know, so it should be easy, really, to find and read. It's about 200 pages, so you might want to choose country by country, but still, please do use it, share it, distribute it as much as possible. Thank you very much all for really coming, and thank you, Katerina, Soren, and Sonia for your words. Thanks. Nice to meet you.